The boy's finger trembled as it pointed toward the clouds, a small, desperate statue in the middle of the bustling gala. No sound left his throat, but his eyes were screaming a language his father had never bothered to learn. Around them, the elite of the city sipped champagne, their laughter drifting like smoke over the manicured grass. They saw a billionaire's son having a moment. They saw a child in a tailored suit acting out. They didn't see the terror. Julian's world was a fortress of glass and high-gloss mahogany, a place where everything had a designated slot and immeasurable value. In the boardroom, silence was power. It was the pause before a kill, the weight of a signature that could erase a competitor. But at home, in the echoing halls of his penthouse, that same silence felt like a structural defect. To Julian, Harrison wasn't just a son. He was a project that had stalled in the development phase. He looked at the boy across the breakfast table and didn't see a child. He saw a series of missed milestones and expensive failures. Every morning followed a rigid, clinical rhythm. Julian would check his data feeds, the blue light of his tablet reflecting in eyes that had grown cold from years of looking at spreadsheets instead of faces. He would glance at Harrison, who sat quietly stacking wooden blocks with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. "Did the new specialist call?" Julian asked, not looking up as he adjusted his silk tie. The nanny's voice was soft, hesitant. "He says Harrison is making progress with nonverbal cues, Mr. Cross. He thinks." "I don't pay for cues," Julian interrupted, his voice like the snap of a dry twig. "I pay for results. I want him to speak. I want him to lead." He's a Cross. He viewed his son's mutism as a technical glitch, a stubborn piece of code that refused to run. To Julian, love was a transaction. He provided the best medical insurance, the quietest living environment, and a trust fund that reached into the stratosphere. In his mind, he was a provider. In reality, he was a landlord. He treated the boy's silence as a personal affront, a wall Harrison had built specifically to lock him out. When Harrison reached out a small hand to show his father a drawing, a swirl of dark lines that looked like a storm, Julian only checked his watch. The drawing was messy. It didn't fit the aesthetic of a man who dealt in straight lines and certainties. "Not now, Harrison. I have a merger to close." He left the room without a touch or a backward glance, the scent of his expensive cologne lingering in the air like a ghost. He walked through the world under a shadow of his own making, convinced that the only way to protect his son was to fix him. He didn't realize that by trying to repair the boy's voice, he was becoming deaf to his heart. He was a man who could forecast a market crash from a mile away, yet he was completely blind to the storm brewing in the small, quiet person standing right in front of him. Sophia sat on the periphery of the gala, a smudge of gray against the vibrant silks and sharp linens of the city's elite. To the passing guests, she was invisible, a piece of street debris that had somehow drifted into the park. But from her vantage point on the weathered wooden bench, Sophia saw everything. She saw the way the wind played with the discarded napkins, the way the light caught the bubbles in the crystal flutes, and most clearly, the way the tall man in the navy suit looked through the small boy beside him. She watched Julian Cross. He was a man who moved with a heavy, pressurized grace, his attention tethered to the vibrating device in his palm. Every few seconds, the boy would tug at his jacket, his little face tight with a frantic, silent message. Each time, Julian would brush him off with clinical efficiency, a flick of the wrist that said stay back, stay quiet, stay small. Sophia felt a pang in her chest that had nothing to do with the hunger gnawing at her stomach. She knew that look. It was the look of someone who was physically present but miles away, separated by a glass wall made of ego and appointments. The boy was pointing now, his finger rigid, aimed at the blue void above the construction site across the street. Sophia's eyes followed the line of his arm. While the wealthy crowd focused on the stage and the speakers, her gaze climbed the yellow lattice of the massive crane looming over the square. At first, it looked like a sleeping giant. Then she saw it. A steel cable, thick as a man's torso, was dancing. It wasn't the rhythmic sway of a machine in motion. It was a jagged, uneven shudder. Higher up, near the pivot point, a plume of rust-colored dust puffed into the air, the sound of grinding metal lost beneath the upbeat jazz of the gala's band. The crane's massive arm groaned, a sound Sophia felt in her teeth. It was tilting, just a fraction of a degree, leaning toward the very spot where the billionaire stood lecturing his son about behavior. The boy's panic was escalating, his feet dancing a desperate rhythm on the grass, his mouth open in a silent, jagged cry. Julian didn't even look up from his screen. He was annoyed, his brow furrowed as he checked his watch, completely unaware that death was suspended by a few fraying strands of wire directly above his head. Sophia gripped the edge of her bench, her knuckles turning white. She realized then that the boy wasn't having a tantrum. He was the only one in the entire park who was truly awake. The world was about to end for the man in the suit, and he was too busy counting his minutes to see that he was running out of them. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of hot grease and grinding iron that no one else seemed to notice. Harrison's chest was heaving now, his small hands reaching out to grab Julian's face, trying to force his father's eyes away from the digital glow of the phone. Julian snapped, his patience finally splintering. He grabbed the boy's wrists, his voice a harsh, controlled hiss of enough. He was so consumed by the perceived rebellion of his son that he failed to hear the first real snap, a sound like a gunshot echoing from the sky. On the bench, Sophia's heart hammered against her ribs. She saw the steel beam lurch, the secondary cable whipping through the air like a dying snake. The billionaire was still looking down, his back turned to the descending shadow. The crowd was a sea of oblivious faces, trapped in their own bubbles of status and conversation. "Look up!" The scream tore out of Sophia with a raw, jagged force that silenced the jazz band. It wasn't a request, it was an explosion. Julian froze, the sheer desperation in the girl's voice piercing through his layer of corporate armor. For the first time in years, he obeyed a command he didn't give. He looked up. The sun disappeared. In its place was a jagged silhouette of steel, screaming as it tore through the air. Time didn't slow down, it collapsed. Julian's instincts, buried under years of spreadsheets and board meetings, finally roared to life. He didn't think about his suit, his phone, or his image. He lunged forward, his large frame diving over Harrison, shielding the small boy with his own body as they hit the dirt. Then, the world ended in thunder. The impact shook the very foundation of the park. A massive steel girder slammed into the earth exactly where they had been standing a heartbeat before, sending a tidal wave of dust, sod, and concrete shards into the air. The sound was deafening, a tectonic groan of twisted metal that drowned out the screams of the fleeing crowd. For a long, terrifying minute, there was only the hiss of settling debris and the smell of ozone. Julian lay in the dirt, his lungs burning with powdered stone, his arms locked in a death grip around his son. He felt a small, frantic heartbeat thumping against his ribs. Slowly, he lifted his head, coughing, his vision blurred by gray grit. Behind him, the crane arm lay like a fallen titan, its jagged edge inches from his heels. He looked down at Harrison, who was covered in dust but staring back with wide, watery eyes. The silence between them was no longer a wall. It was a sanctuary. Julian realized with a sickening jolt that if he had waited one more second to listen to the boy who couldn't speak, they would both be part of the rubble. The ringing in Julian's ears was a hollow, metallic drone that made the world feel distant and underwater. He stayed on the ground for a long time, his expensive wool coat ruined by the red clay and gray soot, his fingers still dug into the soft grass. Beneath him, Harrison was trembling, small, rhythmic shudders that felt like a ticking clock against Julian's chest. The billionaire slowly pulled back, his hands shaking as he brushed the heavy dust from his son's hair. He looked at the fallen girder, a jagged monolith of industrial death that had missed them by less than a yard. Then, he looked at Harrison. The realization didn't come as a spark, it came as a crushing weight. He remembered the boy's frantic pointing. He remembered the way Harrison had gripped his sleeve, the desperate, silent pleading in those eyes he had dismissed as difficult. He remembered his own voice, cold and sharp, telling the boy to be quiet, telling him to stop being a distraction. Harrison hadn't been having a tantrum. He hadn't been seeking attention or acting out a glitch. He had been a sentinel on the wall, the only one brave enough to stand against the sky and scream without a voice. While Julian was busy managing an empire of paper and glass, his broken son had been the only one looking out for his life. Guilt, hot and acidic, rose in Julian's throat. He reached out to touch Harrison's cheek, but his hand stopped in midair, hovering. He felt suddenly unworthy of the contact. How many times had he walked away from those pointing fingers? How many warnings had he ignored because they didn't come in a memo or a verbal report? He had spent years trying to fix Harrison's silence, never once realizing that the silence was full of meaning. He just hadn't been humble enough to listen. Around them, the chaos of the park began to resolve into sirens and shouting voices, but Julian remained in the eye of the storm. He saw his phone lying in the dirt a few feet away. The screen cracked, a notification for a missed meeting still blinking uselessly. It looked like a relic from a dead civilization. He didn't pick it up. Instead, he pulled Harrison back into his arms, burying his face in the boy's dusty shoulder. He didn't care who was watching. He didn't care about the cameras or the Cross reputation. For the first time in his life, Julian Cross wasn't a CEO. He was a father who had almost murdered his son with his own arrogance. The cost of his silence had nearly been everything. The sterile white corridors of the hospital felt like a different planet, a world of humming machines, and the sharp scent of antiseptic that did nothing to wash away the smell of dust still clinging to Julian's skin. Harrison sat on the edge of the exam bed, his small legs dangling, his eyes fixed on the door. He was physically unharmed, a miracle wrapped in a child's sweater, but Julian felt as though he were the one bleeding out. Every time a nurse spoke to him, Julian's voice caught in his throat. He was a man who lived by the power of his words. Yet now, language felt like a shallow, useless thing. As he walked toward the exit to handle the paperwork, he saw her. Sophia was sitting in a plastic chair in the corner of the waiting room, her small frame swallowed by the oversized shadows of the hospital. She looked even smaller here, her worn-out boots tucked under the chair, her face smudged with the same gray grit that covered Julian. She wasn't asking for money or attention. She was just waiting, her eyes scanning the room with that same hauntingly sharp focus she had used in the park. Julian stopped. The air between them was heavy with the echo of her scream. He walked toward her, his expensive shoes clicking on the linoleum, a sound that usually commanded respect, but now felt like a confession of failure. "You," he said, his voice a ragged whisper. Sophia looked up. She didn't flinch. There was a clarity in her gaze that Julian found terrifying. It was the look of someone who saw the truth before the polish. "I didn't think you'd come," she said quietly. "Why did you do it?" Julian asked, his hand tightening around his shattered phone. Everyone else was looking at the stage. "They were looking at me." "Why were you looking at him?" Sophia tilted her head, a stray lock of hair falling over her eyes. "Because he was the only one telling the truth," she said. "I didn't have to hear him to know he was scared. I just had to look at him." "Why didn't you?" The question hit Julian harder than the falling steel. It stripped him bare. He realized in that moment that this girl, who had nothing, possessed the one thing he had traded away for his billions, the ability to truly see another human being. She had recognized the language of his son's soul from 50 yards away, while Julian had spent 6 years standing right next to him, deaf and blind. He looked back at the exam room, where Harrison waited in silence, and for the first time, Julian didn't see a problem to be solved. He saw a child he had left to drown in a world of wealth. Julian sank into the plastic chair beside her, his tailored suit a jarring contrast to the hospital's flickering fluorescent hum. He felt the weight of his empire shifting, the foundations of his life proving as fragile as the crane's frayed cable. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the distant beep of a heart monitor. "How did you hear him when I couldn't?" Sophia looked at her hands, her fingers laced together. "My brother, Leo," she said, her voice soft but steady. "He never spoke a word. Not once. We lost him to the fever 2 winters ago." She looked up, and for a moment, the grime on her face seemed to vanish behind the sheer depth of her gaze. "When you live on the street, People stop talking to you. You become a shadow. You learn quickly that the loudest things in this world are the things people are too afraid or too busy to say out loud. My brother didn't need a voice. He spoke with his shoulders, his breathing, and mostly his eyes. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Julian's with a piercing intensity. You've been waiting for Harrison to come to your world, Mr. Cross. You've been waiting for him to use your words, your logic, your sounds. But he's already speaking. He's screaming. You just have to learn the language of eyes. Julian felt a lump form in his throat. Teach me, he whispered, a billionaire begging a child for wealth he couldn't beg. It's not a code you crack, Sophia said, reaching out to touch the sleeve of his ruined jacket. It's a surrender. You have to stop looking for what's missing and start looking at what's there. Watch the way his pupils widen when he's worried. Watch the tension in his jaw. When he points, don't look at his finger. Look at what his heart is trying to show you. He's not a puzzle to be solved. He's a person to be known. Silence isn't an empty room. It's a crowded one. You just have to be quiet enough to enter it. Julian looked through the glass partition at Harrison, who was watching a moth flutter against the light. For the first time, Julian didn't think about therapy hours or developmental charts. He watched the way the boy's hands moved in small, rhythmic circles, a sign of self-soothing he had always dismissed as a nervous habit. He saw the way Harrison's gaze lingered on the door, waiting for his father. It wasn't a glitch. It was love, wrapped in a silence Julian had finally begun to fear. The penthouse felt different tonight. The vast, floor-to-ceiling windows that usually offered a sense of triumph now looked like the walls of an aquarium, cold, transparent, and isolating. Julian walked through the foyer, the silence of the home no longer feeling like a luxury, but like a heavy shroud. In his pocket, his phone vibrated incessantly. Calls from board members, frantic texts from PR firms, the digital pulse of a life he had prioritized over breathing. He reached into his pocket, his fingers grazing the cracked screen, and for a moment, the old habit flared. Then, he remembered Sophia's eyes. He remembered the shadow of the crane. He pulled the device out and set it on the cold marble console by the door. He didn't turn it off. He simply walked away from it. He found Harrison in the playroom, a space filled with educational toys and expensive gadgets that Julian realized were just colorful bribes for a child he didn't understand. The boy was sitting on the rug, his back to the door, his small shoulders hunched. Usually, Julian would have cleared his throat or called the nanny to announce his arrival. Tonight, he simply knelt. He lowered himself until he was on the same level as the boy, the silk of his trousers dragging on the floor. Harrison turned, his eyes widening in surprise. He looked for the phone in his father's hand, then for the watch his father was always checking. When he found neither, he tilted his head, his brow furrowed in a silent question. Julian didn't speak. He remembered Sophia's words. Silence isn't an empty room. It's a crowded one. He watched the way Harrison's chest rose and fell. He watched the slight tremor in the boy's hands. Slowly, Julian reached out, palm up, and placed his hand on the rug between them. It was an invitation, not a command. Harrison hesitated, his gaze darting from Julian's hand to his face. Julian met his son's eyes and held them. He didn't look away to check a notification or look through the child at a mental to-do list. He stayed. He waited. He surrendered his time. After a long minute, Harrison reached out. Instead of the usual frantic tugging at a sleeve, the boy's small fingers traced the lines on Julian's palm. Then, Harrison looked up and pointed, not at the sky, not at a danger, but at a book on the shelf. It was the one about the storm Julian had always been too busy to read. For the first time, Julian didn't see a delay. He saw a bridge. He reached for the book, his heart thumping with a terrifying, beautiful hope. He wasn't fixing a problem. He was finally starting a conversation. The morning sun flooded the penthouse with a light that felt far too bright for the storm raging in Julian's inbox. His tablet lay on the nightstand, its screen a frantic strobe light of emergency alerts. A merger that had been 2 years in the making, a deal that would define his legacy and add another zero to his net worth, was scheduled to close in less than an hour. His executives were waiting. The lawyers were poised. The Empire was holding its breath. Julian stood in the center of the room, fully dressed in his power suit, his fingers hovering over the silk knot of his tie. Then, he looked at the door. He didn't pick up the tablet. He didn't call his assistant to apologize. He simply turned his back on the billions and walked into Harrison's room. The boy was already awake, sitting in a patch of sunlight, staring at a small sparrow perched on the balcony railing. When Harrison saw his father, his eyes instantly dropped to Julian's hands, searching for the leather briefcase or the silver phone. When he saw they were empty, a soft, tentative light flickered in his expression. "Show me," Julian whispered, his voice thick with a new kind of resolve. Harrison hesitated, then raised a small, pale finger. He pointed at the bird. Julian sat down on the floor, the expensive fabric of his suit bunching uncomfortably, and looked. He didn't just glance. He watched the way the bird's feathers ruffled in the wind, the way its tiny head tilted. For an hour, the world's markets fluctuated and his board members grew furious, but Julian stayed still. They spent the day in a world of silent discovery. Harrison pointed at the way the shadow of a vase moved across the rug, and Julian moved with him, tracing the silhouette. Harrison pointed at a single drop of water clinging to a leaf in the garden, and Julian knelt in the dirt to see the miniature world reflected inside it. Every time Harrison pointed, Julian felt a layer of his old self peel away. He realized that for years, he had been navigating by a map of numbers, while his son had been trying to show him the actual terrain. By noon, his phone was likely melting with messages, but Julian didn't care. He was learning a new currency. He was trading the cold, hollow heights of his empire for the warm, living reality of his son's perspective. Each time their eyes met after a discovery, the bridge between them grew stronger, built not of words, but of shared presence. For the first time in his life, Julian Cross wasn't winning a negotiation. He was finally winning back his soul. The park was quiet now, the scars of the accident hidden beneath fresh sod and the indifferent bloom of spring. Julian stood near the spot where the world had almost ended, but today, his hands weren't buried in his pockets or tethered to a device. One hand was empty, and the other was held firmly by a small, confident grip. Beside them, Sophia stood like a silent guardian, her new coat a gift Julian knew could never repay the debt he owed her. She watched them not as a stranger anymore, but as the witness to a resurrection. Harrison stopped walking. He let go of Julian's hand and slowly raised his arm, his small finger extending toward the vast, open blue of the afternoon sky. In another life, Julian would have felt a jolt of panic. He would have scanned the horizon for falling steel, for frayed cables, for the next disaster he had to manage. He would have looked at the sky with a heart full of shadows. But as he followed the line of his son's finger, he felt a profound, aching stillness. He looked up, and he didn't see a threat. He saw a hawk circling on a thermal. He saw the way the sunlight caught the edge of a cloud, turning it into a ribbon of molten silver. He looked at the sky, and then he looked at Harrison. The boy wasn't shaking. His eyes weren't wide with the terror of an unheeded warning. They were bright with the joy of a shared secret. He was looking at his father, waiting for the connection, his mouth curved into the softest, truest smile Julian had ever seen. Julian knelt in the grass, no longer caring about the dirt or the world he had left behind in the glass towers across the city. He realized that the greatest danger he had ever faced wasn't a falling crane, but the possibility of living his entire life without ever truly knowing the person standing right in front of him. This silence he had tried so hard to fix was actually a symphony of detail, a way of seeing the world that was beautiful, fragile, and deep. "I see it, Harrison," Julian whispered, his voice steady and warm. "I see it all." He didn't need a translator. He didn't need a device. He looked at the horizon, no longer afraid of what might fall, because he was finally grounded in what remained. His eyes were wide open. He wasn't just a man watching a child anymore. He was a father who had finally learned to listen with his soul. As the sun began to dip, casting long, golden shadows across the park, Julian realized he didn't need his son to speak a single word. They were finally, for the very first time, speaking the same language.